Today I think I've found what could well be the best setup for playing games, either retro or even modern, through cloud streaming. This is the OnePlus Open mobile phone, and it features the latest Snapdragon Gen 2 processor, 16GB of RAM, and also 512GB of onboard storage. It's an absolute beast. Regardless of that though, I think any modern folding phone with this same form factor would be absolutely perfect for the same setup. We're going to go through loads of different emulators, have a look at the overall performance, but what I really want you to look at is the way the screen does justice to some of these games. In particular are things like the Nintendo DS. Having the large, almost 4:3 aspect ratio means that you can keep the DS's clamshell design almost on the screen, having it split down the center, and have touch functionality in here as well. I think it's also important to talk about the controller that I'm using here. Now this is the Gamesir G8, which has just come out and works perfectly with any Type-C mobile phone. Doesn't necessarily have to be a folding phone. Well, the Gamesir has all of the usual buttons that you'd expect. It's very ergonomic, and on the back of it there are also 2 buttons that you can assign to extra things or to replace existing buttons if you'd rather use those than press things like L3, which is really nice to see. Setting this up as it runs on the Android system, well, you can do that any which way you want. I chose to go through the Daigisho, is that how you pronounce it? Basically the gaming front end that takes all of your different emulators, you point it to the right folder, and then it generates everything, including getting all of the artworks for your games. With that said, I did have a few issues with some of the emulators, so I downloaded custom ones from the Android Play Store. And also, as a big fan of streaming, I've gone and downloaded all of the streaming apps that I can, and we'll try some of those out as well. Super Nintendo over this aspect ratio looks fantastic. If we take a look at a few different games, you can really get a sense of how that large screen works in actual use. Obviously, having the Gamesir controller, which connects to the USB Type-C, does mean that the screen is shifted down slightly in your hand, slightly higher, but really that doesn't cause any issues whatsoever. In fact, I think we could say that it's quite useful, because when you're laying in bed you can rest the bottom of the screen on your chest and it just holds it in the right spot. Moving over to some PSP emulation then, we've got a couple of good examples here. Tenchu runs really well with no issues at all at 2x native resolution. I could possibly go even higher than that, but I don't really see the point. It looks just fine to me.
Good. Now let's go over Hisatsu. Now's your now. Do it. Well done, Rikimaru.
Not only did I not experience any sound issues, performance remained rock solid. And I have to say, I think this game is slightly underrated. PlayStation 2 is another very good system to run on this device. Running Max Payne, I cranked it all the way up to 4x native resolution, eventually dropping it down slightly and making sure that performance mode was switched on in the battery options, then everything was just hunky-dory. It really was quite impressive running it like this. Next up, we've got Wii and GameCube. Starting off with GameCube then. As we've seen so far across the board, and as we expect really from the Snapdragon Gen 2, things are really running well. The Wii also is working admirably. Things like Xenoblade Chronicles run perfectly here. Because the device uses Android, it does mean that many of these emulators will be able to access its onboard vibration function, essentially giving you haptic feedback in a lot of your games. If we jump over to PlayStation then, this is one of my favourite systems for playing classic RPGs and one of the best of all time. Well, it has to be the Breath of Fire series. I completed 3 back in the day but never got round to playing 4, so I've backed up my legally purchased copy from eBay and let's give that a go. Now I have to say I think a little bit of tweaking is required here, as I've kind of gone a bit ham on all of the visual options, pressing all the buttons and switches I can get my hands on and upping the resolution as much as I can, but even so, bar a little bit of tearing here and there, the performance is still excellent. Sound quality comes through perfectly, and on that note, the OnePlus Open actually has multiple speakers. When you're playing games that utilize good stereo sound, really, it does sound great. Let's have a little sound test and get an idea of the overall sound package this is offering. You may run into a couple of issues using this type of setup. One of them will be aspect ratio problems in things like the PlayStation. Now, you might actually have to set this to stretch in the options depending on the emulator you're using. That seems to be the best one for getting it to confine to the visual area that you want it to and not to stretch outside of the boundaries, ironically, if you set it to something like 4:3. Whether or not this is going to be the perfect setup for you, well, that really depends on a number of factors. The biggest issue with this is the price. Now, obviously, a decent folding phone is going to set you back well over £1,000 or $1,000. You can import certain ones from AliExpress at a discount, or in fact, you could purchase a refurbished or an older model Samsung folding phone, which you'd be able to find for around about half that price. I think whichever you go for, the processor is going to be good enough to emulate most of the games and most of the systems that we've looked at today. Also bear in mind that a lot of these I haven't had a chance to fully tweak and set up yet, and I would imagine that they can be made to perform much better potentially than we're seeing. The screen is another important deciding factor. Here with the OnePlus Open, it's got a very good hinge system which keeps the screen very flat. You probably haven't noticed the crease down the center, and because of the vibrancy of that screen as well and its dark blacks, etc., it also has a 120 Hz refresh rate. All of those things go together to making it a more pleasant experience when you're playing. Now you might say, well, we don't need 120 Hz. No, for most of these games we don't, but actually for Geforce Now, which we'll look at now, you actually see that we can select 120 Hz for its streaming service, which is incredibly good, but it wasn't something that used to be on the Android version. It must have been patched in quite recently. Games on Geforce Now with the Gamesir, it just feels perfect, almost like you're playing natively. I believe the latency is under 50 milliseconds, which might not sound fantastic, but in reality, you don't notice almost any input latency at all. Let's go take a look at some of the best games, starting with Alan Wake 2. As you could probably see, the only time we really experience any issues is when my internet craps out. Now I am in the office at the moment and that's more often than not, but if I'm close to the router or in a better setup like not everyone in the house is watching Netflix, it's absolutely perfect and the image quality is quite stunning. The best game though, in my opinion, to really showcase Geforce Now has to be Cyberpunk 2077 with the latest 2.0 patch. It just looks insanely good, and obviously the aspect ratio is replicated perfectly. You've got almost the entire screen real estate, and you really don't notice that you don't have the wide screen that you've come to, well, you're used to. I think that's mainly down to the fact that the human eye mainly focuses in the middle of where you're looking. The peripherals, they're there and they help, but realistically having this 4:3 aspect ratio or close doesn't seem to be a hindering factor to the overall experience as long as you have that field of view up high enough. So let me know what you think of this one. Was it useful? Has it told you, I don't know, a device that you hadn't thought about before? See you later. I hope you have a lovely week, and as always, don't forget, this is only the 4th video on the channel. Make sure you hit continue.